Thank you, everyone, and thank you to D4D for having this important event. We'll be looking at electronic or digital identities, and we're so glad to have a thoughtful panel with us today. So very quickly, we'll go through each of the panelists, and they'll introduce themselves and let us know their background. And if they have additional notes to make that can be introductory, that is also welcome. So we'll start off with Bronwyn Manby.
My name's Bronwyn Manby. I'm a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, and I have written extensively about the right to a nationality, stateless, the right to legal identity in international law. In terms of an opening statement for this panel, I would start off by saying that identification systems have an extremely long history, millennia, in fact. You can go back more than 2,000 years into ancient China. All functioning societies have identification systems for various purposes. Of course, in terms of state formation, one of the principal purposes was always from the purpose of the monarch, who could be called for military service, who could be made to pay taxes, but increasingly identification is central to the delivery of services as well. But of course, the very same systems can be used for negative purposes, and we can see a good system can turn into a bad system, or a bad system can turn into a good system. We see, for example, extensive identification, including fingerprint identification in apartheid South Africa, used to control the black population. And that has been transformed by the post-apartheid government into a system for providing child support grants and other benefits, which are central to some of the efforts to re-equalize society. Identification can be good and bad. When we look at the institution of digital identification, if we look, for example, at the World Bank's principles on identification for sustainable development, there is a statement, the very first one of those principles, that identification should not discriminate. This is, of course, a good principle, but the problem with identification and non-discrimination is that the purpose of identification systems is indeed to discriminate. Are you a school-aged child? Are you a pensioner? Are you somebody entitled to access the health system? Are you required to perform military service? Are you a citizen and are you not a citizen? Of course, being the central question for identification systems. And even those identity systems that digital identity systems or biometric identification systems that are recently being designed, saying we're not going to deal with, in particular, the citizen non-citizen question. We're going to create a universal identification system that applies to all. And I'm thinking especially of the Indian Aadhaar system. It ends up being a proxy for are you a citizen or are you not? And you see, for example, in India's northeast Assam, where people who are accused of being non-citizens cannot get the Aadhaar identification number, even though it's not supposed to have any bearing on citizenship or not. So what do we do to make digital identification systems not replicate existing patterns of inclusion and exclusion? And we need, on the one hand, in some contexts, we need amendments to the law, substantive legal amendments that regulate citizenship and other types of legal status. And we also need due process protections. And I think for those people who are focused especially on the engineering of the architecture of digital identification, the question is to think about those forms of discrimination and exclusion that apply before you enter the system and possibly after you leave it. So, for example, how do you design a system that if a person is rejected for an application for a particular identity status, what is the resolution of that status? Is the person referred to resources to enable to resolve it? What statistics does the system generate around applications that are not even admitted to be accepted as an application? What types of documents do you have? So there are questions about the design of the architecture of a digital system that can assist to resolve some of the problems, but without those additional safeguards, digital identity will replicate existing patterns of inclusion and exclusion. It's not a magic wand, and it may even make them worse because of the implications of hyper-centralization, where if you had lots of different forms of identification and you might be excluded from some but included in others, now there is a single source of truth, and if you are excluded from that, as in particular identification as a citizen, you are excluded from all.
Thank you for that comprehensive introduction, Bronwyn. I will go to Kaya Kirch.
Hello, it's very nice to be here. My name is Kaya Kirch. I'm from Estonian IT company Cybernetica, and I'm head of Digital Identity Technologies Department. Cybernetica is offering different digital identity technologies and anything related to that. So we cover the full spectrum of digital identity. And I myself previously have worked for the Estonian government authorities for a number of years, taking care of identity management issues and digital identity. As per my opening statement, I will be a bit shorter, and what I wanted to say is that digital identity is never just about technology. If you want to implement digital identity, then technology is just one part of the equation. You always need to have the purpose, and you always need to think through the procedures as well. So as a technology provider, we often see that if somebody plans digital identity system, then they normally plan the most finances to buying the technology needed for that. But technology can only take you halfway. There are a lot of different components that need to be thought through, and technology is just enabling to build a comprehensive digital identity system, but it's definitely not the only component needed.
Thank you for that, Kaya. We move now swiftly to Meredith Woodmanas.
Thank you very much. This is Meredith, Senior ICT Expert within the African Union Commission, supporting the implementation of the digital transformation strategy. So among the digital transformation strategy for Africa, one of the cross-cutting term is digital identity. So from the African Union perspective, it's recognized that identification is a key, any kind of identification. So in Africa, in the world, we are talking about more than 1 billion people don't have legal identification, is estimated. And then half of them are said to be in Africa. So we talk about identification first. We need to have an identification system that works for us, for Africans, to participate meaningfully, to get the social services that we need, to get the education, health, and the basics to participate in those normal life. So we are also setting a very big vision of having digital legal identity for all. So then how do we go about it? We are also talking about free trade area in Africa. We are also talking about digital single market in Africa. So then the basic will be to have an identity, first of all, so that we can meaningfully participate. Digital identity, yes, the technology can help us to overcome some of the drawbacks of the traditional identity, because from where we are not able to cover, even to provide those basic identities. This system or the technology, if we use it properly, it can help us. But we have to learn from the previous that what was the reason why we were not able to have those identity, even the basic identity from the first hand. And then the other is, do we start from our user perspective? What are we needed, especially those people around the rurals? So there are difficulties to integrate. So there is, are forced to go to do informal things because of lack of this. So we can use these digital technologies to enhance our identity gap. At the same time, the digital technology or the digital ID is not coming without risk or anything. So we have to be very cognizant, and we know that the risk is that is coming up. And then the big task is now how to balance the opportunities and the risk, and then avail legal identity, if possible, the digital identity for all Africans, as stated. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move swiftly to Udbhav Tiwari.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Udbhav Tiwari, a senior policy manager for the global public policy team at Mozilla. I work on various issues like privacy, data protection, competition, and connectivity. But one of the key issues that we work on within Mozilla as a part of our work under privacy and data protection is digital identity. And the primary reason that Mozilla got involved in the field of digital identity was that Mozilla's community, being an open source project from India, asked us to really look into the Aadhaar project and the risks that it was creating from both a privacy, but more importantly, an inclusion perspective, as well as engage with the ecosystem in order to try to ensure that the final implementation of that project, which is now, I mean, one could argue almost complete, is as inclusive and as privacy preserving as possible. And throughout the course of that engagement, there were some very key, I think, lessons that we learned, at least internally within Mozilla, about how digital ID programs generally get implemented, right? Like, I think the first primary lesson that we learned was that there is a very serious need to question the role that technologies should play in digital identity programs. It's clear that digital identity is very much here to stay, and all identity systems after a certain amount of point in time will end up becoming digital identity systems. So the role, however, that technology plays in those systems and the design of those technologies before they are implemented at a scale of a population, in the case of India, of over 1 billion people, but also otherwise of hundreds and millions of people, is something that's more often than not an afterthought, or the engagement from players like the industry, but also civil society, really only takes place after it's either been deployed in the world, like live on populations, or when it's just about to be deployed. And we thought, and one of our core learnings under that broader category was the fact that the design of digital identity systems must necessarily be participatory from and by the communities that are going to be impacted by that system, and especially communities that are traditionally marginalized in the societies where these systems will be deployed, but also that choice, accountability, and inclusion are fundamental principles even after this participation takes place, to ensure that the harms of digital ID systems are mitigated to the extent possible. I think it's already been said that it's impossible to build a digital ID system that does not have any risk. But I think the key thing that governments, but also the rest of the sector, can do is to ensure that when they are deployed and that when they are implemented, those risks are thought through and are mitigated to the extent possible in technology, and that the legal framework that governs this is agile enough that as and when new risks, either of security or of inclusion, are detected, that they can be mitigated as quickly as possible without necessarily taking years to fix problems that lead to the denial of very basic public services to the people that need them the most. So that was my opening. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And last but not least, Yasa Musa, please go ahead, introduce yourself, and you have an opening statement.
Hello, everybody. My name is Yasa Musa. I work with Nobel Rights Forum, which is a community-based organization in Nairobi, Kenya. We work on issues around nationality and citizenship to assist the Nubian community and other discriminated communities on access to nationality, because Kenya is one of the most developing countries which is heading towards digitalization. And what I have just said, the issue why we decided to work on issues about digital ID, it's because the Nubian community are facing discrimination, and this discrimination rotates around access to nationality, which is now being linked with services. And now the current situation of digital ID, which is going to be used as the main source of truth and also as the main source of usage for any services in Kenya. We decided at least we get involved to make sure that before the implementation of digital ID in Kenya, Kenyan government makes sure that everybody is all included in all applications of digital ID before implementation of digital ID. So I'm happy to be here and thank you.
Thank you for that, Yasa. And I think for me, it's very interesting to have gone through and listened through your opening statement, because one of the first questions I had was around, do digital ID systems stand to fix the problems or make them worse that already exist with current ID systems? And I think, Bron, you had hinted at the fact that in South Africa, the digital ID systems were used in apartheid, but now they're being used in providing social services. Whereas Yasa Musa can provide a specific example of disenfranchised communities within the Kenyan context that have suffered more discrimination as a result of ID systems. So maybe I can start off with Yasa. Yasa, if you can start off and tell us, do ID systems as they are stand to fix or make worse the problems that already exist with current ID systems?
Thank you so much, Elias, for this great opportunity. What I can start with is about the process of application of national ID in Kenya. The process of application for the Nubian community, because Nubian community is a community that they were here between 1870s up to now. But when you look at the application process of identification card, you are required to apply for a specific period of time. The current way the identification cards that we have is discriminative in what way? Because Nubians have been here more than 100 years. And when you look at the Constitution of Kenya, Chapter 3 of the Constitution, it states that anyone who was in Kenya between 1963 is considered to be a Kenyan by birth. But the process of which the Nubian community and other discriminated communities and stateless communities go through add more challenges, because I can just give a brief application process for the Nubian community. Applications for all Kenyans happens between Monday to Friday, but for the Nubians, it happens only on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, on Tuesday and Thursday, between a specific period. When they apply for these documents, they are given a process called vetting. Vetting is to take a look at where you come from, who you are, how long you've been into Kenya. But the way vetting was brought was to vet people who are at the border, people who border maybe Kenya and Uganda or Kenya and Tanzania. But when you look at the Nubian community, they do not border any place, because they are found in the metropolitan of Nairobi, which is the capital city of Kenya. They are required to go through elders vetting for the scrutiny. After elders vetting, they are required to go through national vetting, which goes between 3 months to 6 months or even 1 year. After that, there is another one called District Security Investigation Committee, which comprises of National Security Intelligence Service officials, National Registry Bureau officials, civil registry chiefs, and elders. But this process does not have a specific time for application. Sometimes you can be called in a period of a span of 1 year. We have a lady who has applied for identification card for the last 10 years. And this process of vetting, they never tell you the specific day when you're supposed to come for application. So this continued discrimination has really marginalized the Nubian community, in which sense many of them are uneducated, many of them are not able to access services, many of them are not able to go to school because the process of application is a challenge. In 2017-2016, Kenyan government introduced National Education Management System, whereby for any child to go to school, you will require a birth certificate. And this birth certificate is one of the challenges the Nubian community face. The NEMIS is a technological way of application and entering school, but this process is still a challenge for the Nubian community because they are not able to access identification cards. For the elderly, application of identification card, you require a birth certificate for your child. For an application of an elderly to get an ID, you require a birth certificate, a copy of your parents' ID, and also living certificate. But for the Nubian community, it goes further for discrimination because they are requested for birth certificate, both parents' identification cards. Sometimes they can even ask you for a title deed. And this title deed is one of the challenges the Nubian community have faced up to now. They cannot access title deeds because you require an identification card to you require an identification card to get an ID, a title deed. So the current situation, Huduma number, which was introduced in 2018, had many challenges that we thought the Kenyan government should address before implementing it. One of it was public participation. There was no participation for the community. There was no discussion within the public on how the architecture or the design should look like. The second one was exclusion. When you look at the way Huduma number now is, it is more excluding because you require these documents, which is identification card, birth certificate, passport, or license for you to be able to register for Huduma number. But these communities do not have these documents. So if we say it's going to solve many challenges, but the real challenges that are supposed to be solved have not yet been talked about. Looking into data privacy, the architecture and the way Huduma number is digital ID, it is more discrimination because it does not tell us how the privacy of a person will be protected. When you look at the Huduma bill itself, it does not specify on if your data has been breached, who is able to notify you. It does not tell you how you're going to solve that issue and might lead to more exclusion and profiling. For example, if your fingerprints have been taken by a press of a button, if there is no legal frameworks to be able to protect someone, by a press of a button, I can be called Al-Shabaab because the government has all the details. The government has all the information. And when you look at UNHCR, they had a 10-year plan of ending discrimination by 2024. One of it is making sure birth certificates are accessible to everybody. This is still not the case. We've experienced how this has been more discriminating during COVID-19, where all services were suspended and everything were made to be online. When you look at the rural areas, they cannot be able to apply for birth certificates. When you look at the only people who can benefit in application of birth certificate at the moment, because it was suspended, are the elites, because you require an internet, you will require a laptop, and you will be required at least to apply for all those. But nearly 70% of the community members cannot be able to access these internet services. So that is more exclusion because Huduma number and digital ID will require internet for application of all and everything. The inclusion of services is one of the biggest challenges because during the registration of Huduma number, through the government's data, they say they registered 36 million Kenyans. And in Kenya, we have approximately 47 million Kenyans. So if Huduma number goes as it is, it will lock close to 11 million Kenyans who did not apply for identification card. So what we wanted, at least for the solution to make sure that no one is excluded, we want to solve all identification issues first before putting a law like Huduma Bill 2021 in place. In Section 10, Clause B, instead of documentary proof as may be required, this I'm talking about a bill that is supposed to be made an act. And if the bill is made an act, then it's going to make Huduma number mandatory. And if Huduma number is made mandatory, then the government of Kenya will have the opportunity of making sure without Huduma card, you won't be able to get services. So we want the government to ensure the bill or regulation establish flexibility in without by making sure that everyone applies for documentation and it is included. If exclusion can't be comprehensively addressed to protect Kenyans like Nubians, anyone in all corners in the country will be locked out, and the bill and the system as it is at the moment needs to be addressed well. Mambi talked about the architecture. We have a case we filed in France challenging the architecture of Huduma number because it is not inclusive. And the kits that were used are more exclusionary because those people whose fingerprints cannot be readable, they cannot get services. So if Huduma goes as it is, people who do not have readable fingerprints, people who do not have identification cards, all of them are going to be locked out further because including ethnic services makes them more discriminated than the current situation now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Yasser. And I think you tapped Bronwyn, and I think because Bronwyn, you talked about apartheid, and now that those systems are now being used to provide social services. But in the case of stateless individuals, as Yasser was alluding to in terms of the Nubians in Kenya, it seems like the situation becomes much worse, and especially if you consider the use of biometrics. And I'm sure I'm going to tap Kaya because Kaya talked about making sure that it's not just about technology. But Bronwyn, I'm curious to hear from you. How how can we look at that situation?
So I think Yasser Musa has very eloquently set out how digital identity systems will replicate the problems of existing identity systems. And the Nubian Rights Forum, which he works, does fantastic work in terms of trying to help individuals, but also advocate for changes to the system. If one looks at the apartheid system, of course, historically, the systems were not digital, but they were biometric because they were based on fingerprints. You know, what changed was a complete reform of the law and the political situation with the ending of apartheid. Had a digital identity system been introduced under the apartheid system, it would have exacerbated the exclusion of the previous system. What enabled the identification system to become more inclusive was the change in the law. I mean, at every level, all sorts of laws were radically reformed, including the citizenship, and of course, the political will to make a difference. Not that I want to say that post-apartheid South Africa is some paradise. There remain a lot of problems of exclusion and including of stateless people, but the identification system was fundamentally repurposed. What I think is problematic is there is a lot of rhetoric about the introduction of digital identification systems as if they will magically solve the problems of the people who are excluded from existing systems. They will not unless extremely deliberate efforts are made to resolve those situations. These efforts may require law reform. They may require especially changes to the Citizenship Act, Nationality Code, whichever you call it at national level, saying that people who do not have another nationality should be nationals of the state where they are born and resident. But it also requires a whole set of reforms about due process, about what the digital identification system does with people who apply but do not have the feeder documents on which an application is said to be based. So, what do you do for, if you are a Nubian and you do not have a birth certificate, or especially if you say, but we need your parents and your grandparents' birth certificates as well, which is completely impossible to demand because we're going back into the colonial era and people's births were not registered. So it's just a way of excluding people. If your digital identification system, it could be designed in such a way that says people who don't have a birth certificate, you put them into this track, they get given assistance, they get late registration of birth, all of that is sorted out, and then they're entered into the digital identification system. But if that is not designed into the process, it's not going to happen magically. It needs resources to be allocated. It might need law reform. It might need procedural reform. It doesn't happen by magic. The introduction of a new identification system is always a notorious place for the opportunity or risk of creating stateless populations, but it is also an opportunity by the same token to resolve the situation of groups at risk of statelessness. And I would just challenge on one thing as well. I think the Nubians would say that they are not stateless. They are Kenyans whose citizenship is difficult to assert because of discrimination. It's different from a situation where somebody, you know, under the law they are Kenyans, but they face discrimination in getting that recognition. There's a slightly different challenge for people who are not under the law citizens of any country, and that also needs to be resolved. But the larger number of people those who are citizens, but the systems do not allow them to prove it.
Thank you for that. And Kaya, you had mentioned a point here around technology can take you only so far. So I'm curious what you think of that. And then I'll move to Utbab because I'm curious to understand Utbab from the ANDA system and the lessons that we have seen from that. And then finally, Miret, I would be interested for you to understand this context, given that you're speaking from an African Union perspective. But Kaya, please tell us about how technology can take us only so far.
I was just listening to when Yasa talked about those different problems, and I was thinking that there would be so many technical possibilities to solve those problems. But if you don't have proper procedures in place, then those technical possibilities may just create new problems. And what I mean by proper procedures is that you need to really think through how the technical solution is inclusive for all people. You mentioned biometrics earlier. So for example, there are different ways to use biometric technologies. You can identify people basically by face and by fingerprints. But if you don't think through what kind of people you would need to be entered into that system, then it can be very easily discriminative because you don't have, first of all, reference database normally. You start from somewhere, you just starting collecting biometrics. If you don't have reference database, you don't have anywhere to match. The second of all, not everybody is able to give fingerprints. There may be certain medical conditions why it's not possible to capture your fingerprints. There may be disabilities. If you don't have fingers, then you're not able to provide fingerprints. Now, if the system is so that you need to provide fingerprints and then you get some sort of benefit, then you immediately exclude some of the people who can't just provide that biometrics. So it is about implementation of the biometrics and procedures that can help you. And when Bronwyn said that that there is this expectation that digital identity will magically solve the problems that identity system or identity management system has had, then I completely agree with that. That's something that we've seen quite a lot. Is that when you put that magic word digital in front of something, then this seems to be much better than the previous paper-based system. But in fact, you will still have the same problems because any kind of digital identity system relies on a proper identity management. So if you have problems in identity management, then yes, digital identity perhaps can fix that problem, but only if you fix that problem by creating also proper digital identity management system, which is inclusive. So in that sense, digital identity really isn't magical. It doesn't solve the problems by itself. But whoever applies or implements the digital identity needs to first think through why they do that. What is the purpose of digital identity? What is the content of digital identity? Because, for example, well, I come from Estonia, and when Estonians talk about digital identity, for us, this means this ID card-based system where the ID card only has minimum set of data, and you use the ID card or mobile ID to access different services where there is the rest of the data. So, for example, when I want to check my medical data, or my doctor wants to check my medical data, I log in with the ID card. And the ID card only has my name, my date of birth, my ID code, and the rest of the data is in the database. Now, some of the other countries see it differently, and digital identity for some of the countries mean that the digital data within the database or on the card is also part of digital identity. So my point is that the understanding of those two words, digital identity, can be very different. For Estonia, this is just the key to access other data that's in some secure database. But for some others, digital identity can mean that it's my digital medical data, it's my digital data about my parents, my citizenship, and things like that. So that's also an important point to make, that when digital identity system is built, then we may not always understand it the same way when somebody says digital identity. It can mean different things for different countries. But yes, once again, I completely agree that just having digital identity doesn't solve any of the problems. But it can be done so that within the project of setting up digital identity, you need to solve those other problems as well, because digital identity always relies on proper identity management.
Fantastic. And so, Udbhav, I'm curious, with the Aadhaar deployment, has it been perfect? Have we seen problems made worse in India?
Sure. I mean, I think that like the Aadhaar deployment is a very good example of concerns that when digital ID programs are being deployed are raised as hypotheticals by members of civil society and researchers, saying that these are the problems that will happen, are ignored when the project is being implemented. The harms start occurring in the real world and often last for many years. And then the same solutions that were proposed at the time at which the proposals were being deployed are ultimately implemented with a delay of 5, 7, sometimes even 10 years in order to prevent some of those harms from taking place, right? And I think there are a couple of really good examples of that. Like one of those sort of bigger examples from an inclusion perspective is that even when the Aadhaar was being deployed, one of the, and it's something that's been said in this panel before as well, that was raised was it requires reliable connectivity in order to be able to perform authentication, right? And that's simply not available in many parts of India, where the Aadhaar is used to, say, give daily public delivery service rations, access to very basic government services. But those concerns were not really engaged with when the system was rolled out. After there were documented instances of people being denied their rations so consistently and for such a long period of time that there have been some recorded instances of deaths taking place because of those rations not reaching them in time because of authentication failures, that as recently as I think about 2.5 to 3 years ago, offline authentication was made possible, which requires a device that the an individual at the public delivery service has, and that merely verifies the details using the QR code that's present within the Aadhaar in order to provide the requisite government service, right? So as a solution, this could have very easily been implemented before the first Aadhaar was issued, but it took close to 1 billion Aadhaars being issued and those consequences taking place before it was implemented in reality. There's a second example that I'd like to use, and that's the last one from a security and privacy perspective, right? Like when the Aadhaar was issued, the fact that every individual was only going to have one Aadhaar, it was not going to be possible for it to be deleted or modified in any way. And neither was there a way for someone to have their Aadhaar changed or to have multiple Aadhaars at the same time, led to this scenario where once individuals suffered from a breach, which could be either because they left their Aadhaar, say, in a shop, or because there were dedicated groups of individuals who were exploiting vulnerabilities in the system to either deny them their access to public services or even sometimes commit financial fraud. It meant that there was nothing that they could really do about it. I mean, you could go file a police complaint and the police would try to investigate the case, but that's the equivalent of like putting up a phone number, like a photograph of the front and back of your credit card onto the internet, and despite it being exploited, not really being able to do anything about that number itself. And despite that, like the sort of very obvious problems of not being able to revoke your Aadhaar number or revoke one number and get another one, which is still, by the way, the case in India, about 3.5 4 years ago, after like very well documented instances of these scams were brought to the public light, India started issuing virtual IDs along with your Aadhaar number. So you could generate a number, a 16-digit number over and above your Aadhaar number, and you could share that 16-digit number instead. And that number was revocable. So it was still protected. There was still a number that, under that 16-digit number, which was your core Aadhaar number, but you could print a card, go around with that card, use that card for the purposes of authentication, all the while your code number would not necessarily be publicly exposed. And if the same example that I gave earlier of the card sort of, of credit card information leaking publicly were to take place with your Aadhaar, that would become like users could revoke it. Customer care from the WhyID AI, which is the agency that runs the system, could tell consumers to do that, right? And those are just two examples of solutions that are quite simple, don't really require radical technical changes to be implemented, and in fact were proposed earlier but were simply not engaged with by the entities that were implementing the system. And I think a lot of what's been said in the conversation on the panel so far really reiterates the fact that rather than trying to deal with these problems in a post-facto manner or in the way where there's a deadline for deployment of having X million people enrolled in the system that needs to be met, and a lot of the other concerns aren't necessarily engaged with, really needs to change to becoming one that is more participatory and one where technical designs of systems are actually subject to sufficient public review. Because everything that I've said so far, as you can imagine, is by no means the average level of digital literacy that exists in any country in the world, not just India, but anywhere else. So to expect users to be able to even do things like issue a virtual ID, revoke it, get another system, then and do that is a real, I would be stunned if more than a couple of percentage of the Indian population could do that in a reliable manner. But the fact that those solutions exist and them being implemented and understood by the public are two very separate things, right? So making sure there is sufficient lead up time, making sure there's educational awareness about it, making sure that the staff on the ground that uses these ID systems understands them so that they can help populations that don't necessarily have the requisite level of digital literacy to be able to perform these fairly complex interactions are all things that digital ID programs should consider and think about.
Thank you for that. So Meredith, coming to you, you are from a vantage point, for me, I think you've had a chance to listen to some of the challenges that come with implementing digital ID systems, and even in ones where you have the biggest democracy in the world, India, they've had problems. So are these the things that you are at your perch at the African Union considering? Are you listening to the problems that could potentially arise from digital ID systems, and how do you see them?
Yeah, thank you very much. Live experience and then practical problems listening is enlightening, and then it really gives a good experience. Maybe to take further the matter, we also not expecting digital ID will solve all the problems overnight. To take it further, digital ID won't operate in vacuum. So it needs infrastructure. It needs the skill. It needs the necessary regulation. It needs the necessary policy. These things needs to come up front before you embark on building or implementing big projects. However, there are always pros and cons. So we are in a situation where most of our population doesn't have, half of the population almost doesn't have any form of ID. And then being today, as we are today, how are we going to solve these problems? Because those half of the population without an ID, and then how can we expand our conventional or traditional ID system to avail those, to make it inclusive and provide more ID? So technology as a technology, digitization can give us an opportunity to exploit and to reach more, understanding, learning from the other experience. We learn from India. We know we are experiencing what experience in Kenya, Estonia, in other countries as well. we need to learn from them. But at the same time, we have to be able to use the technology to leapfrog and then to solve our burning issues. So there are the risks, and knowing the risks will help us, and then we'll open our minds as well. How are we going to approach it? How are we going to practically implement it? We are talking about a continental free trade area, which we expect a lot of advantage for Africans. Then if we don't have an ID, which should be interoperable, that will give us the freedom to go from one country to the other, to exploit this big market. How do we exploit the potential of this digital technology to solve our burning problems? Understanding the risks and the challenges that can bring to us. So as I said, it needs to be a balance from our perspective. So we need to balance, we need to be aware, and then we have to be very clear how to implement it, how to make it practical. So it is not going to be covered or solved in a single day, but we need to have a roadmap over the line. We have to know and make aware our member states as well, the need to have self-driven, not coming from the technology providers, because we have so many systems around the world, not accepting whatever is coming. It should be driven from inside, and then we try to customize the technology to fit our need. But technology as a technology, it has own drawbacks and it has own advantage. So in my opinion, we have to explore the potential, understanding the challenges and the risks of the digital technologies that can bring to us. Thank you.
Yeah, so it seems like there is consensus that there are certain things that need to be in place in order for digital ID frameworks to work. And so I'm curious, Kaya, can you lead the discussion here and tell us how then can we design digital ID systems that are inclusive, that do not exclude, that are addressing these different components?
Well, first of all, I would say that we need to start from the problem, identifying what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And by identifying that problem, we can then move on to deciding what is the best system for the country, what are the components that need to be developed. But the first and foremost thing should be identify why we are doing this. What are we trying to solve? And to build an inclusive digital identity system, we also need to think what can go wrong. So one of the risks of implementing digital identity is that, well, first of all, it may not be inclusive, but the second one is that it may increase fraud. So if we implement technology in a way that we don't really focus on onboarding, we don't really focus on making sure that we know who this person is who receives this digital identity, then this in fact can enhance fraud, because somebody else can impersonate me and use my digital identity, for example, and say that well, they are Kaya Kirchen, they want to do this kind of financial transaction, and me as an average citizen will have huge problems because of that. So that's also one of the important issues to think when building inclusive digital identity. How do you prevent fraud? How do you make sure that the digital identity system actually fulfills two purposes? And first of those purposes is definitely that when I use my digital identity, I want to prove to whomever I present this, I want to prove that I am who I claim to be. But there is other side of that, which is equally important, is that no one else should be able to claim to be me. So that's also a very important part of the digital identity, to make sure that these are actual individuals who can use their own identity, and nobody else can get their identity, or nobody else can use the technology so that they can use the digital identity of somebody else. So that's also important part of the digital identity. And the third point I want to make is that when building digital identity, it should be based on the exact society where you build it. Now, coming from Estonia and being Estonian IT company, we talk to a lot of different countries who want to implement their digital identity. Now, some of the potential clients say that we don't want to do what Estonia did. We don't like it, we don't want to do it. And then there are other types of clients who say, we want to do exactly what Estonia did, because Estonian system is good. But what we always recommend is that you have to be somewhere in between and think through what is comfortable for your society. Because identity and managing identity can be different in different societies. It is different what is comfortable for a society. So what is comfortable for Estonia may not be proper for some other countries. And that's why it needs to be built based on the needs of that specific society. So one of the examples could be that in Estonia, for example, we have ID code. It's 11-digit number assigned to every single person in Estonia. It stays the same throughout the life. So that's what I'm identified by. And it's quite public information. It's not a secret what the ID code is. We use it in digital services all the time. So it's normal for our society. But for example, another European country, Germany, we know that they would never implement that kind of ID code because they don't feel comfortable with having some number attached to the person. And that's okay. They can build something else. They can have different type of system, but they can still have digital identity. So what I mean is that what is appropriate for one country, one society, may not be appropriate for another society. So we shouldn't have that one size fits all solution. It's rather each society would need to have their own solution to solve their problems that they have in their specific society.
And Kaya, correct me, but is it correct that Estonia does not use biometrics in your ID system?
We use biometrics for onboarding.
For onboarding.
We don't use biometrics for authentication. We use biometrics, we collect biometrics when we issue ID cards and passports, and we have biometrics on the chip of the passport and on the chip of the ID card as well, but it's not used for authentication. The passports, for example, are used for traveling because they are compliant with ICAO rules, and then they're used, for example, in the automated border gates in the airports. But we don't use biometrics for authentication or for digital identity. We have cryptographic solutions for authentication and digital signing.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm curious, Yasa, how do you see the potential for deploying ID solutions that are inclusive? How do you think the design should be? What are the key points you think you should be put in place?
I think at the moment, the government needs to make sure that all laws are put into place. There is a judgment that was made in 2020, whereby the government was told to make sure that they come up with all safeguarding guidelines and regulations that will protect all citizens. Also, they have to make the system decentralized, because at the moment the system is centralized, meaning if your data has been breached, you have to leave all the way from Mombasa to Nairobi. It is still happening at the current situation when you apply for passports. The entire nation, they can only apply for passports in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu, and also Eldoret. This is not what we need. We need to make sure that it is all inclusive. You don't need to leave Nairobi, or you don't need to leave your rural area to come to Nairobi to apply for Huduma number. When you look at the current situation, close to 45% of Kenyans can access internet. So if only 45 can access internet, means 65% will not be able to even use that digital ID, because you require electricity, you require internet for you to be able to use these services. So the government should make sure it is all inclusive, all internet is covered all across the nation, and everyone can be able to access without traveling from a specific place to another. The current situation of application for identification cards, for passport, for birth certificate, for example, people have to travel for kilometers to go and apply for birth certificates. So if the situation at the moment is you have to travel for kilometers, or you have to use a lot of resources to access a birth certificate, how sure are we now that the current situation will be solved if that document needed to register for Huduma number is still a challenge to access it? They should also address and make sure the stateless communities, the communities like the Nubians, have access to all documents before they implement it. I heard Kaya said about a microchip. We estimate that the card might cost approximately 500 shillings. That is close to $5. The normal average Kenyan live under $1 in a day. So if a card is lost, will I be thinking about saving money to apply for another card, which is more expensive? Or will I be thinking to look for money that will be able to cover my needs, such as education, such as food, and etc., etc.? So the government has to make sure all these are in place. The current bill says children will be given cards at the age of 6 years. We all know the nature of our children. You send them somewhere, you give them money, in the next 5 minutes they've lost it. So how many times will they be losing these cards, and how many times will they be replacing the cards? So that is discrimination that people are seeing now. Before, the cards used to look like it is only going to discriminate certain communities, while other communities are going to get services. But when you look at now the architecture, it discriminates everybody, not only the stateless communities, not only the communities which are at risk of becoming stateless, but everybody who is going to register for Huduma number. Lastly, we can just use an example of the current situation in Uganda. Uganda are using digital ID, whereby now the government has said without them having that card, they cannot access services such as health, such as education. Now, giving that example where Uganda is clear, they already know if you don't have an ID, you won't get access to services. Unlike Kenya, whereby civil societies have to dig and then realize the gaps that are there. For Kenyans, we always fight. For something we don't even know. Even the current architecture, we don't know how it is made. The public participation has never been there. All the court orders that have been put into place, the government keeps on pushing them aside. And now they're using parliament to push for implementation of Huduma number and Huduma card. So all these things have to be sorted out. Kenyans need to be taken through public participation. They need to understand why are they engaging themselves in this identification, and what positives do they have, because currently the only things that we've seen is risks and profiling and excluding of Kenyans. Thank you.
Thank you. And it seems like we've run out of time. So I'll give Bronwyn, Udbav, and Miret about a minute each in terms of how we can be able to design inclusive digital ID systems.
So assuming you mean to go in that order, my 1 minute is just to say that I think we need to recognize that there are conflicting interests here, and the importance, therefore, of democratic oversight and the additional risks of identification where that oversight is missing or limited. It's not sufficient to say what is comfortable for that society. There will be different interests in each society, and there's a real importance to respect the international norms and standards that exist, to strengthen those standards, and to make sure that they are applied at national level.
Udbav?
Thanks. I mean, I think that I'd like to just conclude by maybe like reiterating and expanding upon that like list of principles by which Mozilla thinks digital ID systems should be designed. Like there are 5 primary principles. The first, we believe that digital ID systems should always provide a multiplicity of choices, that regardless of the system deployed, it should never be made mandatory to use a singular ID system for a singular task, and that users should always, and citizens and residents should always have choice in what ID system they choose to use for a particular task as much as possible. The second is decentralization. We believe that the centralization of like sensitive biometric data is deeply problematic, and along with other critical sensitive data, and measures that either allow it to be stored on the devices of the cards themselves rather than centrally, or not stored in a centralized form but decentralized and broken up into like different sort of geographical locations in order to improve their resilience is essential. The third is accountability, and we think that like both legal accountability is of course essential, but there should also be technical accountability that allows users of these digital ID systems to be able to hold entities to account on the basis of technical information that is kept about the transactions, that, or failures more importantly, so that if legal cases and other forms of like accountability are enforced in a privacy preserving manner, it's possible to do so technically. And the last 2 are inclusion and participation. I've spoken about a fair bit about them earlier in the talk, so I won't go into detail, but inclusion to the extent that people who use these ID systems should not be discriminated from the point of design, and participation in that civil society and technical communities, especially ones that represent marginalized groups, should be involved in the design of these systems before they are implemented. And we think that all of these are also principles generally from openness, and therefore and from the open source sort of tech movement, and they apply pretty well to digital ID systems as well. Thank you.
Meredith, over to you.
Not to add much, maybe the first one would be to solve some particular problem, and then addressing this community, and then solve the solutions that can solve community problem is one. The other thing, when we start designing, I think it's good to think in mind the sustainability of the system that should serve for a longer period of time, so we don't start and pilot and stop it. And then we start. The other is we start from small, so we don't have to start a big one. We start from small. We test it. If it works, then it will be scalable. The other maybe the last one should be very much consultative. And very last is interoperability, open and common standard application will be also points that needs to be into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been a very interesting conversation. I wish we had more time to dig deeper into those principles of how a digital ID system might look like that is inclusive. But I thank you all, Bronwyn Manby, Kaya Kirch, Meredith Woodmanas, Udbav Tiwari, and Yasa Musa. Thank you so much for your insights.